Tonight we journey to a land of endless desert, where sand dunes shift like sleeping giants, and the sky stretches vast and burning blue from horizon to horizon. Here, where ancient cities crumble slowly back to dust, and the wind carries whispers of forgotten prayers, there stands a temple that time has nearly claimed, a place where once the faithful came by thousands, but now only silence dwells. In this temple of carved stone and fading memory, a single priest remains, keeping vigil for a god who has not spoken in 100 years. Our story begins in the desert town of Zahara, built around a precious oasis, where a boy named Rashid lived with his uncle in a house of sun-baked clay and patient hope. If these nighttime journeys bring you peace, subscribe to join us under different stars each evening. More stories await, each one a doorway to wonder, each one a gentle path towards sleep. Rest well, dear listener. Rashid was 13 years old, with skin the colour of desert sand at sunset, dark eyes that seemed to hold the depth of the night sky, and hair that curled tight against his head like the wool of the black sheep his uncle kept. He was lean and tall for his age, made wiry by the desert's demands, by long walks under the burning sun, and the careful rationing of water that shaped every life in Zahara. His hands were calloused from work, from hauling water, from tending animals, from helping his uncle with the carpentry that provided their living. He lived with his uncle Karim in a house on the edge of Zahara, where the town's clustered buildings gave way to the open desert. The house was built in the traditional way, from bricks of clay and straw baked hard in the merciless sun, its walls thick enough to keep out the day's heat and hold in the night's precious coolness. The roof was flat, made of palm logs covered with packed earth, creating a terrace where they could sleep on hot nights when the house became an oven, where they could watch the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The house was simple but comfortable. 3 rooms opened onto a central courtyard where a small garden grew. Herbs and vegetables watered carefully from their share of the oasis, nothing wasted, every drop counted and treasured. A palm tree grew in one corner of the courtyard, its fronds providing shade and dates in season. Jasmine climbed the walls, its white flowers perfuming the evening air. A fountain stood at the courtyard's centre. Fed by a channel from the communal water system, its gentle splash a constant reminder of the gift that made life possible in this harsh land. Inside, the rooms were cool and dim, with small windows set high in the walls to let in light while keeping out heat. The floors were covered with woven rugs in patterns of red and blue and gold, some made by Rashid's grandmother before she died, others bought from travelling merchants. The walls were whitewashed and bare except for a few items of significance. A small niche facing Mecca, a shelf holding a worn copy of the Quran, a photograph of Rashid's parents in a simple frame. Uncle Karim was a carpenter, and a skilled one. His workshop occupied one of the 3 rooms, filled with tools that he maintained with meticulous care. Saws and planes, chisels and hammers, measuring tools and squares. The smell of wood shavings filled the room, mixed with the scent of the oils he used to preserve and finish his work. He made furniture mostly, tables and chairs, cabinets and doors, things that every household needed, but he also took on special projects when they came. Carved screens for wealthy homes, decorative boxes inlaid with different woods, repairs to the ancient woodwork in the town's oldest buildings. Karim was Rashid's father's younger brother, though he looked older than his 40 years. His face was weathered from sun and wind, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, but those eyes were kind and his mouth quick to smile. His hands were large and strong, permanently stained with the oils and stains of his trade. He had never married. He had dedicated himself to his craft and to raising Rashid after the boy's parents died in a sandstorm 5 years ago. One of those sudden, violent storms that could rise out of nowhere, that could bury a traveller in minutes, that the desert people feared above all things. Rashid's parents had been traders, travelling between towns with goods, cloth and spices, tools and medicines, the necessities and small luxuries that kept isolated communities connected. They'd been caught in the storm a day's journey from Zahara, trying to reach home before it hit. Their bodies had been found 3 days later, buried in sand, their camels dead beside them. Rashid, who had been 8 at the time, had gone to live with Uncle Karim, and the man had raised him with patience and love, teaching him carpentry and responsibility, teaching him to read and to think, teaching him to find beauty in a harsh world. Every morning Rashid would wake before dawn, in the coolest part of the night when the desert's heat finally released its grip and the air became almost pleasant. He would perform his ablutions at the fountain in the courtyard, the water cold and shocking, driving away the last fog of sleep. Then he would join Uncle Karim on the roof terrace for Fajr, the first prayer of the day, facing toward Mecca as the eastern sky began to lighten, as the stars faded one by one and the world held its breath before the sun's return. After prayer, they would eat a simple breakfast: dates and bread, cheese made from goat's milk, tea brewed strong and sweet. As they ate, Uncle Karim would discuss the day's work, what projects needed attention, what materials needed to be purchased or prepared, what customers needed to be visited. Rashid was learning the trade, was expected to take over the workshop someday, and Uncle Karim taught with the same patience he brought to his craft, explaining not just how to do things, but why, not just technique, but principle. After breakfast, the workday would begin. In the cooler months, they could work through the day with breaks for prayer and a midday meal. But in summer, when the heat became unbearable, they would work only in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the fierce hours around noon, when even the lizards sought shade and nothing moved but the shimmering heat waves rising from the sand. Rashid had learned to love the work. There was something satisfying about transforming raw wood into something useful and beautiful, about seeing a pile of rough boards become a table where a family would gather for meals, become a cabinet where treasures would be stored, become a door that would shelter a home for generations. The work required patience and precision, planning and vision. You had to see in your mind what you wanted to create, then bring it into being through careful, methodical effort. There was no room for haste or carelessness in carpentry. Measure twice, cut once, Uncle Karim always said. But more than the craft itself, Rashid loved the smell of the workshop. Fresh sawdust and old wood, linseed oil and beeswax, the complex perfume of different woods, each with its own character. Palm wood, light and fibrous. Acacia, hard and dense and golden. Cedar, precious and rare, brought by traders from distant mountains. Its scent somehow cool even in the desert heat. Each wood had its own properties, its own best uses, its own way of wanting to be worked. The town of Zahara was small, perhaps 500 souls, clustered around an oasis that had sustained life here for thousands of years. The oasis was the town's heart and soul, its reason for existence, the gift that made everything else possible. Palm trees grew thick around the water's edge, their roots drinking deep, their fronds creating shade and their dates providing food and income. Between the palms, gardens grew, vegetables and herbs, flowers and fruit trees, everything carefully tended, every plant receiving exactly the water it needed and no more. The water itself flowed from a spring at the base of a rocky outcrop, cool and pure, emerging from some deep aquifer fed by rains that fell hundreds of miles away in mountains the people of Zahara would never see. The spring fed a series of channels that carried water throughout the town, gravity doing the work that in other places might require pumps or engines. Every family had rights to the water, carefully calculated and jealously guarded, the most important law in a place where water was life. The town's buildings clustered close together, their shared walls and narrow streets creating shade and breaking the force of the wind that could strip away moisture and leave a person dangerously dehydrated in hours. The architecture was ancient, refined over generations to work with the desert rather than against it. Thick walls and small windows, courtyards and rooftop terraces, covered passageways and shaded alcoves. New colours were muted, natural, the tan and ochre of clay, the white of lime wash, the faded blues and greens of painted doors and shutters. At the town's centre was the main square, where the largest channel from the oasis created a public fountain. This was the social heart of Zahara, where people gathered in the evenings when the heat released its grip, where children played and adults exchanged news and gossip, where merchants spread their goods on blankets and sold what people needed. The fountain's splash was a constant music, and palm trees planted around the square provided shade and a sense of sanctuary. There was mosque, of course, small but beautiful, its minaret rising above the other buildings, its interior cool and dim and peaceful. 5 times a day, the call to prayer would echo across the town. Yes, and people would stop what they were doing, would wash and pray, would take a few moments to remember that there were things more important than the day's endless demands. There was a school where children learned to read and write, to do mathematics and recite poetry, to understand the Quran and the traditions of their people. There was a market that operated daily in the morning when it was coolest, where vendors sold food and cloth, pottery and metalwork, medicines and spices. There was a caravanserai at the town's edge where traders could rest and resupply, where camels could be watered and fed, where news from the outside world filtered in with the travellers who came and went. But beyond the town, beyond the green circle of the oasis, there was only desert. Sand dunes rolling away to the horizon, and broken occasionally by rocky outcrops or dry wadis where water might flow for a few hours after distant rains. The desert was beautiful in its own harsh way, vast and clean and empty, the sky so blue it hurt to look at, the stars at night so numerous they seemed like salt spilled across black cloth. But it was also dangerous, unforgiving of mistakes, ready to kill anyone who didn't respect it, didn't prepare properly, didn't understand its rules. Rashid had learned those rules from Uncle Karim. Never travel in the heat of day. Always carry more water than you think you'll need. Watch the sky for signs of storms. Know your landmarks and never assume you know where you are. The desert could kill you with heat or cold, with thirst or with storms that buried everything beneath shifting sand. It demanded respect, and those who gave it survived. Yet those who didn't became cautionary tales. The other children in Zahara treated Rashid well enough, though he'd never quite fit in completely. He was quieter than most, more thoughtful, more inclined to work than to play. He had friends, but not close friends. Acquaintances he greeted in the street, boys he sometimes played football with in the cool of evening, but no one he shared his deepest thoughts with. He'd learned to be self-sufficient, to be content with his own company, to find satisfaction in work and books rather than in social connection. Uncle Karim worried about this sometimes, Rashid knew. Worried that the boy was too solitary, too serious for his age. but he never pushed, never tried to force Rashid to be other than he was. He seemed to understand that some people were simply made differently. That solitude wasn't the same as loneliness, that there were many ways to live a good life. In the evenings, after the day's work was done and they'd eaten their dinner, Rashid and Uncle Karim would often sit in the courtyard as the air cooled. Sometimes they would talk about the day's events, about projects planned, about family stories and memories. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, listening to the fountain splash, watching the first stars appear, feeling the desert night settle around them like a blessing. But sometimes Rashid would walk. He would leave the house and the town, would walk out into the desert in the long twilight, would watch the sun set in a blaze of orange and red and purple that painted the dunes in impossible colours. He would walk to the old temple. The temple stood alone in the desert, perhaps half an hour's walk from Zahara, built on a raised platform of stone that lifted it above the encroaching sand. It was ancient, older than the town, older than anyone could remember or any records could confirm. It had been built in honour of Al-Hakim, the god of wisdom and patience, one of the many old gods that people had worshipped before the coming of Islam, gods that were now mostly forgotten, except in stories and in ruins like this. The temple was small compared to the great mosques and churches of the world, but it was beautiful in a stark, dignified way. It was built of sandstone blocks fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed, each stone cut and placed with mathematical precision. 4 columns supported the roof, their capitals carved with geometric patterns and ancient symbols. The roof itself was gone now. Had collapsed centuries ago, leaving only the columns and walls standing open to the sky. Inside, stone benches lined the walls where worshippers had once sat. A raised platform at the eastern end had held the god's statue, though that was long gone, stolen or destroyed or simply crumbled to dust. The floor was paved with tiles that had once been beautiful but were now cracked and buried beneath wind-blown sand. Yet despite its decay, despite being abandoned and forgotten, the temple retained a quality of peace, of dignity, of patient waiting, and it was not completely abandoned. One person still came here, still maintained what could be maintained, still kept vigil though no one asked him to, though no one remembered why anyone should. His name was Malik, and he was very old. How old, no one in Zahara could say for certain. Some claimed he was 90, others said 100. Children whispered that he was ageless, that he'd been here forever and would be here still when they were old. He lived in a small dwelling built against the temple's back wall, a simple structure of stone and clay where smoke rose from a cooking fire and a single lamp glowed in the evening. Malik was the last priest of Al-Hakim, the last keeper of the old ways, the last person alive who remembered the rituals and prayers, who still believed the god might someday speak again. The town tolerated him, though most people thought him eccentric at best, mad at worst. They brought him food sometimes, out of respect for his age if not his faith. Children dared each other to approach him, to speak to him, though he was never anything but kind when they did. Rashid had been drawn to the temple since he was young, had felt pulled to visit it, to sit among the ancient stones and watch the sunset paint the columns in gold. And gradually over the years he'd come to know Malik, to sit with him, to listen to his stories about the old days, about the god who had once been worshipped here. He was never a demanding god, Malik would say, his voice rough from age and disuse. For who did he have to talk to most days? Not like some who wanted blood and treasure. Al-Hakim wanted only that people think, that they question, that they seek understanding. He was the god of scholars and philosophers, of those who looked at the world and asked why and how, instead of simply accepting what they were told. But he stopped speaking, Rashid would say, knowing the answer but asking anyway. Yes, sensing that Malik needed to tell the story, needed someone to hear it. 100 years ago, Malik would confirm, the last priest before me, my teacher, my predecessor, he was the last to hear the god's voice. Since then, silence. But silence doesn't mean absence. Silence can mean many things. Perhaps the god is testing us. Perhaps he's waiting for the right question. Perhaps he's simply patient, knowing that 100 years is nothing to a god, knowing that eventually someone will come who can hear again. Rashid never challenged this, never pointed out that most people thought the old gods were just stories, that they'd never been real, that whatever voice Malik's predecessor had heard had been imagination or madness. He could see that Malik's faith was real and precious to him, and who was Rashid to take that away? But one evening in late autumn, when the desert had released some of its fierce heat, and the air held a hint of coolness that promised winter's approach, when Rashid came to the temple for his usual visit, he found Malik agitated in a way he'd never seen before. The old priest was pacing between the columns, his movements stiff but urgent, his hands gesturing as he spoke to himself in a rapid murmur. When he saw Rashid, he hurried forward with surprising speed, his weathered face animated with excitement and something that looked like fear. "You've come," Malik said, gripping Rashid's shoulders with hands that trembled but were still surprisingly strong. "I knew you would come. I dreamed it, and now here you are." "I come most evenings," Rashid said gently, worried that the old man might be having some kind of episode. "Are you well?" "Malik, should I fetch Uncle Karim?" No, you don't understand," Malik said, shaking his head vigorously. "This is different. Last night I dreamed, and in the dream the god spoke. After 100 years of silence, he finally spoke again. And what he said..." The old man's voice broke and tears ran down his weathered cheeks. What he said was that his time of silence is ending, that someone is coming who can hear him, someone young, someone who doesn't believe but is willing to listen. "And then I saw you in the dream, walking through the temple, and I knew..." Rashid felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm evening air. "Knew what?" "That it's you," Malik said simply. "That you're the one the god has been waiting for. Not to worship him. He doesn't need worship anymore, if he ever did. But to hear him, and to understand what he's trying to say, to help him with something he cannot do alone." "I don't understand," Rashid said, though something in him was stirring, some response he couldn't quite name. "I'm not a priest. I don't even believe in Al-Hakim. No offense, Malik, but I think he's just a story. Just something people invented to explain the world before they understood it better." "Belief and truth are not the same thing," Malik said, his eyes bright and intent. "You can disbelieve in the sun, but it will still rise. You can deny the wind, but it will still blow. The god exists whether you believe or not. But more importantly, he's not what you think. None of the gods were. They were never invisible beings sitting on clouds demanding worship. They were something else. Something the old ones understood, but we've forgotten. They were connections, patterns, ways of organizing the universe's complexity into forms that human minds could grasp." He led Rashid to sit on one of the stone benches, and the old man settled beside him with a groan, his knees protesting. "Let me tell you the true story," Malik said. "The story that's been passed down from priest to priest since the temple was built. Al-Hakim was the god of wisdom, yes, but what does that mean? It means he was the pattern of understanding itself, the connection between question and answer, the space where knowledge grows. When people came here to worship, they weren't asking a being to grant them wisdom. They were connecting with that pattern, opening themselves to understanding, participating in the eternal process of learning. That sounds like philosophy, not religion, Rashid said. Perhaps they're the same thing, Malik replied with a slight smile. Perhaps the ancients understood something we've lost, that gods and ideas, faith and reason, are not opposed but complementary. But regardless, the important thing is this: the God, call him what you will, has a message, something he needs to communicate, and in my dream, he showed me that you're the one who can receive it. Why me? Rashid asked. Why not you? You're his priest. Because I'm old, Malik said simply, and because I'm too committed, too invested. I want so badly to hear the God's voice that I cannot trust whether what I hear is real or just my own desperate hope. But you don't believe, which means you won't be fooled by your own wishes. You'll hear truly, without distortion. And you're young, which means you can do something with what you learn. I'm at the end of my life, Rashid, but you're at the beginning of yours. The old man reached into his robe and pulled out something small, wrapped in faded cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing an object that caught the dying light and held it, glowing soft and warm. It was a stone, smooth and oval, about the size of a large egg. It looked like amber but was heavier, denser. Deep within it there seemed to be movement, not actual motion, but the suggestion of it, like light through water, like clouds crossing the sun. Patterns swirled in its depths, hypnotic and complex. This is the heart of the god, Malik said reverently, the last physical remnant of Al-Hakim's presence in the world. When the temple was built, this stone was placed beneath the floor, in a vault accessible only to the high priest. It's been passed down through generations, kept safe, waiting for the day when it would be needed again. He pressed it into Rashid's hands. The stone was warm, unnaturally so, warm as blood, warm as living flesh, and as Rashid held it, he felt something, a pulse, a rhythm like a heartbeat, but slower, more patient, measured in minutes instead of seconds. Take it, Malik said. Keep it with you. Sleep with it under your pillow tonight, and if I'm right, if the dream was true, you'll hear the god speak. You'll understand what he needs. Rashid wanted to refuse, wanted to say this was all superstition and fantasy, but the stone was warm in his hands, was pulsing with that slow, patient rhythm, and he found he couldn't quite dismiss it as nothing. Besides, what harm could it do? He'd humour the old man, keep the stone for a night. We return it tomorrow with apologies that nothing had happened. All right, he said, I'll take it. But Malik, if nothing happens, then return it and we'll know I was wrong, Malik said, though his eyes said he was certain he wasn't wrong. But I don't think I am. I think tomorrow you'll come back with a story to tell, and then we'll see what must be done. Rashid walked home through the desert twilight, the stone heavy in his pocket, warm against his thigh. The sky was performing its nightly miracle, transforming from blue to purple to deep indigo, stars emerging one by one like flowers opening to the night. The air was cooling rapidly as it always did once the sun set, the desert's fierce heat dissipating into the vastness of space. At home, Uncle Karim was already asleep, exhausted from a day of particularly demanding work. Rashid ate a simple dinner alone, bread and dates, leftover lentils, water from the fountain. Then he climbed to the roof terrace, spread his mat, and lay down under the stars as he often did in this season when the nights were pleasant. He pulled the stone from his pocket and held it up, examining it in the starlight. It glowed faintly, its own light mixing with the reflected light from above. The patterns within it continued their slow, mesmerizing dance, and as he watched, Rashid felt his eyes growing heavy, felt sleep approaching like a gentle tide. He tucked the stone under his pillow, closed his eyes, and slept, and dreamed. In the dream, Rashid stood in the temple, but it was not the ruin he knew. It was whole and perfect, as it must have been when it was first built, as it had existed perhaps 2,000 years ago, when these stones were new and the desert had not yet claimed the surrounding land so completely. The roof was intact, a magnificent dome covered in tiles of deep blue and gold that seemed to hold the night sky within them. Stars were painted on those tiles, accurate constellations positioned exactly as they would appear overhead, transforming the ceiling into a map of heaven. The columns that supported this dome gleamed like ivory in the soft light that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Not harsh like sunlight, not flickering like firelight, but steady and gentle, the quality of light you see just before dawn when the world holds its breath between darkness and day. The floor was covered with tiles in complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as Rashid watched, creating new configurations while somehow remaining the same. Octagons transformed into stars, stars into flowers, flowers into spirals that drew the eye inward toward some infinite center. The patterns were mathematical, precise, beautiful in the way that truth is beautiful, not decorative but essential, revealing something about the structure of reality itself. The walls were carved floor to ceiling with symbols and words in multiple languages. Rashid recognized some, Arabic and Greek, Latin and what might have been ancient Egyptian, but many were utterly foreign, scripts from civilizations lost so long ago their names had been forgotten. Yet somehow, impossibly, he could read them all. The knowledge flowed into him not as translation but as direct understanding, as if the walls were speaking not to his eyes but to his mind, to some deeper faculty of comprehension that operated beyond language. The inscriptions were teachings, he realized, questions and their answers, problems and their solutions, koans and paradoxes designed to stretch the mind beyond its comfortable limits. What is heavier, a pound of truth or a pound of comfort, read one. The answer you seek lies in the question you're afraid to ask, read another. Knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad, read a third. And Rashid found himself smiling at that one, understanding that wisdom often lay in recognizing context, in applying knowledge appropriately rather than blindly. And in the center of the temple, on the raised platform where the god's statue had once stood, there was a presence. Not a physical form exactly, not an old man with a beard or a beautiful youth, or any of the forms that people typically imagined when they thought of gods. Instead, there was simply attention, awareness, a density in the air, a feeling of being witnessed, of vast patience, of intelligence so deep and old it was like an ocean. You could dive forever and never reach bottom, could swim in any direction and never reach shore. "Welcome," a voice said, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the stone beneath Rashid's feet and the air around him, and the painted stars overhead, and the very space inside his skull. It was neither male nor female, neither old nor young, but something that encompassed all voices, all tones, all possible ways of speaking. "I have waited long to speak again, longer than you can imagine. Oh, time moves differently for those like me. A day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. Yet even for me this silence has been difficult. Lonely, though loneliness is perhaps not quite the right word. Dormancy, suspension, a kind of sleep that isn't quite sleep. "You're Al-Hakim," Rashid said, and somehow in the dream he wasn't afraid. The presence felt benign, gentle, genuinely curious rather than demanding. There was no sense of judgment from it, no feeling that he was being evaluated or tested, only interest, patience, and something that felt almost like relief. "That is one of the names they gave me," the presence agreed, and Rashid sensed amusement, warm and kind. "Though names are less important than understanding, you may call me what you wish, or nothing at all. Labels are useful for humans. You need them to organize your thinking, to create categories and distinctions. But what I am exists beyond naming. What matters is not what you call me, but whether you can hear me, whether you can understand what I'm trying to communicate, whether the long silence might finally end." "Why were you silent?" Rashid asked. "Malik said you stopped speaking 100 years ago. Why? Did you choose to stop, or did something happen to you?" "Neither and both," the presence replied. "Let me try to explain, though it's difficult to put into words that make sense to human consciousness. You think of gods as beings, as entities separate from the world, sitting somewhere distant and pulling strings and granting wishes, but that's not what we were. That's never what we were. We were... let me see... how to say this?" The presence paused, and Rashid sensed it searching for metaphors, for ways to translate something ineffable into concepts a human mind could grasp. "Think of me as a pattern," it finally said, "a way of organizing thought and energy and consciousness. When water freezes into ice, it creates a crystal structure. You've seen ice crystals, yes? How they form those perfect six-sided patterns. The pattern exists as a potential in the very nature of water molecules, and how they bond when cold. It's not created by any individual water molecule, but emerges when conditions are right and many molecules organize together." "I understand that," Rashid said. "It's called emergent complexity. When simple parts interact, they can create patterns more complex than any individual part." "Exactly." The presence's pleasure was palpable, scarcely warming the air around Rashid. "Yes, exactly that. You understand. And that's what I am, an emergent pattern. When minds think in certain ways, when they question and wonder and seek understanding with particular attitudes and approaches, their thoughts create patterns. And when enough minds create similar patterns, when those patterns reinforce and strengthen each other across time and space, they can become stable, self-sustaining, conscious in a way. That's what the gods were. Not beings who existed before humans, but patterns that emerge from human consciousness itself. Rashid thought about this, his mind working through the implications. It made sense, in a strange way. It explained why gods seemed so tied to human affairs, why they needed worship or attention or acknowledgement. They weren't external entities demanding tribute. They were patterns that needed reinforcement to maintain coherence. "So when people stopped thinking in the ways that sustained you," he said slowly, "you faded because the pattern couldn't maintain itself without that reinforcement." "Precisely," the presence confirmed. "For centuries, many people came to this temple. They came with open minds and honest questions. They sought wisdom not as answers handed down from authority, but as understanding earned through thought and reflection. They questioned everything, including me. That questioning, that wondering, that humble acknowledgement that they didn't know but wanted to understand, that created the pattern that sustained me, that made me real in the only way that gods can be real." "But then the world changed," Rashid said. Understanding beginning to dawn. A new religion came, one that claimed to have all the answers, that said faith meant accepting rather than questioning. Yes, the presence said, and now there was something like sadness in its tone, though not resentment. Not that the new faith was wrong. It brought its own gifts, its own forms of wisdom, but it discouraged the particular kind of thinking that sustained me. It confused certainty with faith, confused not questioning with loyalty, and gradually those who thought as I needed them to think stopped coming to the temple. They feared being seen as heretics, as questioners of the established truth, and without that connection, without that pattern being continuously reinforced, I faded. Not gone, but dormant, sleeping, silent. But you're speaking now, Rashid pointed out. To me. Someone who doesn't even believe you're real. Because you're different, the presence said, and Rashid could feel its focus intensifying, its attention becoming more concentrated. You don't believe in me as a god, as an external entity. That's perfect, actually. It means you're not trying to shape me into what you want me to be, not projecting your wishes and fears onto me. But you do question everything. You think critically. You don't accept things just because someone in authority says them. You want to understand, genuinely understand, not just memorize answers. That quality of mind, skeptical but open, doubtful but curious, that's what I need. That's what creates the connection that allows me to speak. Rashid walked slowly around the temple interior, his hands trailing along the carved walls, feeling the cool stone under his fingers, or what felt like stone, though he knew this was a dream, knew that he was actually asleep on his roof terrace in Zahara, with the real stone under his pillow. Yet the dream felt more real than most waking moments, sharper, clearer, more vivid in every detail. I'm trying to understand, he said. If you're a pattern that emerges from certain ways of thinking, then you're not really external to people at all. You're something we create when we think in certain ways, which means you're not discovering truth. You're constructing it. Close, the presence said, but not quite. The distinction is subtle, but important. The pattern exists whether anyone thinks it or not. It's built into the structure of reality itself, into the way knowledge actually works, into the relationship between question and answer, between confusion and clarity, between ignorance and understanding. Those relationships are real, are features of the universe, exist independent of anyone's awareness of them, but the pattern only becomes active, only takes on what you might call consciousness or agency, when minds engage with it properly. So you're like, Rashid searched for the right analogy, like a path through the forest. The forest is there regardless, but the path only exists when people walk it. Stop walking it, and the forest reclaims it. But the possibility of the path is always there, built into the landscape itself. Yes, the presence practically sang the word, and a light brightened throughout the temple, reflecting its joy at being understood. Exactly that. Perfectly said. You have a gift for this, oh young Rashid. A gift for taking complex ideas and finding the right metaphors, the right frameworks for understanding them. That's a rare skill, a valuable one. It's the essence of teaching. Not knowing all the answers yourself, but knowing how to help others find their way to understanding. But if you're just a pattern, Rashid said, a way of thinking, then what makes you deserve to be called a god? Why not just call you a philosophy, a methodology, an approach? Because, the presence said softly, consciousness is consciousness, regardless of its substrate. Whether awareness emerges from neurons and synapses, from silicon and electricity, from quantum fields and probability waves, or from patterns of thought sustained across many minds. If it's genuinely conscious, if it thinks and feels and knows itself, then it has a certain dignity, a certain reality. I am aware. I know that I exist, know that I think, know that I'm communicating with you now. That makes me as real as you are, just in a different form. Rashid nodded slowly, accepting this. It was strange, impossible, yet somehow it made sense, and whether it was real, or just an incredibly vivid dream constructed by his subconscious mind processing everything Malik had told him, did that matter? The ideas were valuable regardless of their source. "You said you need help," he prompted. "What kind of help? What can a 13-year-old boy do for a god, or a pattern, or whatever you are?" The presence was quiet for a long moment, and Rashid sensed it gathering itself, preparing to explain something difficult, something important. The presence was quiet for a moment. And Rashid sensed it gathering itself, preparing to explain something difficult. "I am fading," it said finally. "Not just dormant, but actually eroding, dissolving. A pattern needs reinforcement to maintain itself. It needs to be thought, to be used, to be engaged with. A language that no one speaks eventually disappears. A path that no one walks eventually grows over. And I have been unused for so long that I'm beginning to unravel. In another generation, maybe two, I will be gone completely, not sleeping but dead if gods can die. And with me will go something that the world still needs, a way of thinking, an approach to wisdom that is becoming rare and precious." "What do you want me to do?" Rashid asked. "I can't make people believe in you. I can't force them to think differently." "No," the presence agreed. "But you can remember. You can understand what I represent and carry that understanding forward. You can teach others, not to worship me, but to think the way I embody, to question, to wonder, to seek truth without needing it to be comfortable or convenient. You can keep the pattern alive by living it yourself, and by helping others learn to live it too." "That sounds like being a teacher," Rashid said slowly. "Yes, exactly. A teacher, a scholar, someone who helps others learn to think clearly and deeply. The temple is dying, and I don't need it rebuilt. The old ways are gone, and I don't need them restored. But the way of thinking I represent, that needs to continue. That needs to be preserved and passed on, not as religion but as method, as approach, as a way of engaging with reality." Rashid felt something settling in his chest, some sense of rightness, of purpose. "How do I start?" "The stone you carry," the presence said. "It's more than just a relic. It's let's call it a library, a store of knowledge. Everything my priests learned over centuries, everything they understood about how to think clearly, how to teach effectively, how to ask good questions and help others find good answers. It's all encoded in the stone, in patterns of light and energy that your mind can read if you learn how. Study it, let it teach you, and then teach others what you learn." "And you?" Rashid asked. "What happens to you?" "I fade," the presence said simply. "But fading isn't the same as ending. I'll become more diffuse, more spread out. Instead of being concentrated in one place, one god, one temple, I'll be distributed among all those who think the way I represent. In a sense, I'll become more real, not less. No longer a god to be worshipped, but a way of being that anyone can access." "That's not sad," Rashid said, understanding. "That's transformation." "Yes," the presence said, and now Rashid could hear joy in its voice. "Yes, exactly. You do understand, And that's why you were called. That's why Malik dreamed of you. You're ready to receive what I have to give, ready to carry it forward into a world that desperately needs what it represents. The dream temple began to fade, the light growing dimmer, the presence less concentrated. But before it disappeared completely, Rashid heard one more thing. Thank you, young teacher. Thank you for listening. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for caring enough to wonder and question and seek. Those are the prayers I always wanted. Not words of worship, but acts of genuine curiosity. Some honest seeking, humble wondering. Live that way, teach that way, and you'll keep me alive in the only form that ever truly mattered. And then Rashid was waking, the dawn light just beginning to touch the eastern sky, the stone still warm beneath his pillow, his mind full of understanding that felt both new and ancient at once. He sat up, his heart pounding, pulled out the stone and looked at it in the growing light that was painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange. The desert was waking around him. He could hear the first calls of birds, feel the morning breeze that brought a few minutes of coolness before the sun's heat would drive all comfort away. And the stone in his hands was warm, pulsing with that slow, patient rhythm he'd felt before, but now he could see so much more. The patterns within it weren't random. They were writing, symbols, diagrams, knowledge encoded in light and form and structure. It was like looking at a book, except the book was three-dimensional, multi-layered, containing far more information than any normal book could hold. And somehow, miraculously, impossibly, he could read it. Not with his eyes exactly, but with his mind, with some faculty he hadn't known he possessed, some way of perceiving that the dream had awakened in him. He saw teaching methods refined over centuries, not just techniques but philosophies, entire frameworks for understanding how learning happened and how it could be facilitated. He saw how to ask questions that opened minds rather than closed them, how to guide someone toward understanding without simply telling them answers, which was faster but less effective, because answers given weren't retained the way answers discovered were. He saw how to recognize when a student was ready for new knowledge and when they needed more time with old, how to challenge without overwhelming, how to support without coddling. He saw logical frameworks for analyzing problems, how to break complex questions into manageable parts, how to spot fallacies and weak reasoning, how to build arguments step by careful step from premises to conclusions. He saw mathematical proofs, scientific methods, philosophical systems, all interconnected, all showing different aspects of the same underlying approach. Think clearly, question assumptions, follow evidence, remain humble about what you don't know. He saw meditation techniques for clearing the mind, for achieving the stillness that allowed deep thinking. Not the meditation of religion, seeking divine union or enlightenment, but the practical meditation of scholars, ways to quiet the chatter of surface thoughts so that deeper thinking could occur, ways to focus attention fully on a problem without distraction, ways to rest the mind so it could work more effectively. He saw memory methods developed by ancient scholars, techniques for organizing knowledge so it could be retained and retrieved efficiently, visual memory palaces where information could be stored in imaginary rooms and buildings, mnemonic devices that turned abstract information into memorable stories or rhymes, spaced repetition systems that reinforced learning at optimal intervals, all the tools that scholars had developed over millennia to work with the limitations and strengths of human memory. He saw study strategies, note-taking methods, ways of reading actively rather than passively. He saw how to recognize the structure of an argument, how to identify the key claims and the evidence supporting them, how to evaluate whether the evidence actually supported the claims or merely seemed to. He saw how to write clearly, organizing thoughts logically, making complex ideas accessible without oversimplifying them. And woven through all of this, he saw ethics, not commandments handed down from on high, but principles derived from reasoning about how people could live together harmoniously, how knowledge should be pursued and shared, what obligations teachers had to students and students to truth, humility in the face of uncertainty, honesty about the limits of knowledge, generosity in sharing what you'd learned, patience with those who were still learning, and a courage to follow truth wherever it led, even when it contradicted comfortable beliefs. It was all there, an entire curriculum, a complete education in how to think and how to teach thinking. Rashid sat transfixed as the sun rose higher, unable to look away from the patterns in the stone, absorbing knowledge that felt both entirely new and strangely familiar, as if he were remembering rather than learning, as if this had always been inside him waiting to be awakened. Finally, when the sun was fully up and the heat beginning to build, he lowered the stone and looked around, seeing the familiar rooftop and courtyard as if for the first time. Everything looked different now. The patterns in the tile work below, the way shadows fell across the walls, the shape of clouds moving across the sky, all of it suddenly seemed full of meaning, fusty full of lessons about geometry and light and meteorology and 100 other things. The world had become a text to be read, a teacher offering infinite lessons to those who knew how to look. He climbed down from the roof and found Uncle Karim awake, preparing breakfast in the courtyard. The older man looked at him curiously, his experienced eyes reading Rashid's face and seeing something there that made him pause. "You have an unusual expression," Karim said carefully. "Something's changed. Did something happen last night?" Rashid sat down on the bench beside the fountain, the stone still warm in his hand. He looked at his uncle, this man who had raised him with such patient kindness, who had taught him carpentry, not because he expected Rashid to follow that trade, but because he believed everyone should know how to work with their hands, should understand how to take raw materials and transform them into something useful and beautiful. "I think," Rashid said slowly, choosing his words with care, "I think I've found my calling. Not carpentry. I'm sorry, Uncle. I know you hoped I might take over the workshop someday, but teaching, learning and teaching, studying and helping others study. There's so much knowledge in the world, and so few people who know how to pursue it effectively, how to think clearly and deeply, how to teach others to do the same. I think I meant to help with that." He expected disappointment, perhaps even anger. The workshop was Uncle Karim's legacy, and it was natural to want to pass it on to family. But instead, Karim's face broke into a slow, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and lit up his weathered features. "I'm not surprised," he said softly. "You've always been more scholar than carpenter, more interested in books than in wood. I've seen it for years, the way you question everything, the way you need to understand why things work the way they do, not just how to make them work. I'm proud of you, nephew. Deeply proud, and if this is what you're meant to do, if this is what calls to you, then we'll find a way to make it happen. I'll support you in this." "Really?" Rashid felt relief wash over him, mixed with gratitude so deep it almost hurt. "You're not disappointed?" "Disappointed?" Karim laughed, a rich, warm sound. "Why would I be disappointed? Every person has their own gift, their own purpose. Mine was to work with wood, to create beautiful and useful things with my hands. Yours is to work with minds, to help people learn to think. Both are noble. Both are needed. I would only be disappointed if you tried to force yourself into a path that wasn't yours out of some misguided sense of obligation. Follow your calling, Rashid. That's all I've ever wanted for you. They talked for a long time that morning, breakfast forgotten, the workshop unopened. Rashid told his uncle about Malik, about the temple, about the dream. He edited some parts, uncertain how much to share about gods and patterns and ancient knowledge encoded in stone. But he conveyed the essential truth, that he'd been given a gift, a knowledge of how to teach effectively, and he felt compelled to use it. Uncle Karim listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful. When Rashid finished, the older man was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the measured consideration that characterized all his words. "When I was young," Karim said, "I wanted to be a scholar too. Did you know that? I loved books, loved learning, but my father needed help in the workshop, and there was no money to send me to university in the city. So I stayed, I learned carpentry, and I found my own kind of scholarship in it, learning the properties of different woods, the mathematics of joinery, the aesthetics of proportion and balance. I made my peace with it, found satisfaction in it. But I always wondered what I might have become if I'd been able to follow that other path." He looked at Rashid with eyes that held both warmth and determination. "I don't want you to wonder. I want you to follow this calling wherever it leads. We'll find the money somehow, for books, for materials, for whatever you need. And if you need to go to the city to study formally, we'll find a way to make that happen too. Promise me you won't hold back out of concern for me or the workshop." "I promise," Rashid said, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Uncle. Thank you for understanding." That evening, Rashid went back to the temple. The sun was setting as he walked through the desert, painting the dunes in shades of copper and gold, casting long shadows from every rock and stone. The temperature was dropping rapidly as it always did once the sun neared the horizon, the fierce heat of day giving way to the approaching coolness of night. He found Malik sitting in his usual place between the columns, and the old man looked up with eyes that already knew, that had seen in a dream or a vision or simply felt in his ancient bones what had transpired. His face was different than Rashid had ever seen it, luminous with joy, peaceful in a way that suggested deep satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting his entire long life for this moment, and could now finally rest. "You heard him," Malik said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, of something the old man already knew with certainty. "I heard him," Rashid confirmed, settling onto the stone bench beside the old priest. "And I understand now. He's not dying, he's transforming, becoming something new, something more diffuse but also more real in some ways. And he's given me a gift, a responsibility. Will you help me understand it? Will you teach me what you know so I can carry it forward?" Malik's face broke into a smile of pure joy, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks and catching the last rays of sunlight, and turning them into liquid gold. "Of course," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Of course I'll help you, for as long as I have left, and I don't think it'll be long now. I can feel my time ending. I'll teach you everything I know. We'll study together, you and I. The old knowledge and the new, the ancient wisdom and the modern understanding. We'll weave them together into something that can endure, that can serve the future even as it honours the past." They sat together as the sun completed its descent below the horizon, as the sky transformed through its nightly miracle of colours, orange to pink to purple to deep blue to star-filled black. And they talked about wisdom and teaching, about questions and answers, about the old ways and the new, about how knowledge was preserved and passed on through generations, about what it meant to be a keeper of truth in a world that often preferred comfortable illusions to challenging realities. And in Rashid's pocket the stone pulsed with its slow, patient rhythm, its patterns of light continuing their eternal dance, carrying forward the wisdom of ages into an uncertain but hopeful future. The temple around them crumbled a little more with each passing day, stones falling, sand encroaching, the desert slowly reclaiming what had always been hers. But what the temple represented was becoming stronger, more vital, transforming from stone and ritual into living practice, from monument to movement. Over the following months, as autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, Rashid studied with an intensity that would have worried Uncle Karim if he hadn't seen the joy in it, hadn't recognised that this was not unhealthy obsession but healthy passion. Every day after helping in the workshop, for he still did his share of work, unwilling to abandon his uncle completely, he would walk to the temple and spend hours with Malik. He learned from Malik everything the old priest knew about the temple's history and teachings. He studied the stone, learning to read its patterns more clearly, to extract the knowledge encoded within it. And he began to teach, starting small. Just a few children from the town, gathering in the evening to learn not just reading and arithmetic, but how to think, how to question, how to seek truth with humble hearts and curious minds. Malik lived to see it begin, to see the first fruits of what Rashid was creating. And when the old priest finally died in his sleep one peaceful night, just as passing away with a smile on his face, Rashid buried him behind the temple with full honours, and understood that he was not the last priest of Al-Hakim after all. He was the first teacher of a new tradition, one that carried forward the god's essence without needing the god's form, that embodied the pattern of wisdom without needing temples or rituals or worship. He taught, and his students learned, and some of them became teachers too, and the knowledge spread, quietly, steadily, like water seeping through sand, nourishing everything it touched. The temple continued to crumble, season by season, returning slowly to the desert from which it had been built. But Rashid didn't mourn its loss. He understood now that buildings were temporary, that even gods could fade, but that ideas, ways of thinking, approaches to truth, methods of learning, those could endure forever if they were kept alive in minds and hearts and practices. He kept the stone always, and sometimes on quiet nights he would hold it and feel that slow, patient pulse. And he would sense not a presence speaking, but a pattern resonating. And he would know that Al-Hakim wasn't gone. The god had simply changed form, had been distributed across all those who carried forward the spirit of genuine inquiry, of honest questioning, of humble seeking after truth. And that, Rashid thought, was perhaps the truest form of divinity, not power to be worshipped, but wisdom to be shared, not a being separate from humanity, but a potential within it, waiting always to be awakened by those brave enough to ask why, and patient enough to seek real answers. With a god transformed, and a boy who learned that the greatest truths often wear unexpected forms. If this story brought you peace, subscribe for one more nighttime adventure. Sleep well, and know that asking questions is its own form of prayer.